Professor Susanne Bruyere. Susanne is Professor of Disability Studies and the Director of the Keyleesi Yang and Hockey Tan Institute on Employment and Disability in Cornell University, Industrial and Labour Relations School in Ithaca, New York. She will be speaking today on building a more neurodiversity-inclusive workplace.
Thank you for that introduction. And will you be putting up my slides or having me do so?
I'll just check that for you. Susanne, just 1 second.
Okay, no problem. Take your time.
You can share them from where you are, Susanne.
All right, I will do so.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks for this invitation. I am delighted to be a part of this conversation. Neurodiversity in the workplace is a very important part of an array of activities that we do at the Yang Tan Institute in the ILR School at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. And our focus is, as the name says, employment and disability broadly conceived, but neurodiversity over the last 5 years has become a very increasing part of what we're examining, because from 30 years of employment research around what makes workplaces inclusive for individuals with disabilities, we've been able to leverage some of that knowledge to apply to these wonderful programs that are blooming in the workplace in many, many corners now, starting out in the tech sector, but now over many industries. And we're excited to be here to have this as a part of the conversation around more inclusive programs in neurodiversity and more broadly that we've been discussing over the last 2 days. So in the time I have with you, I'm going to be talking about the importance of neurodiversity practices considerations across the employment process. It's not enough just to get someone into the workplace. It's important to think about how can you keep them there and have them thrive and advance. Good practices, therefore, in neurodiversity recruitment, screening, interviewing, hiring, and onboarding. So we will stay pretty much with the front end of the employment process in the beginning, but I also will talk a bit about retention, career development, performance management, and how to sustain these programs with both effective use of internal, company-specific or organization-specific resources, as well as community-based external resources, and how we think about keeping these programs in place and having them thrive and also scale either in other parts of the organization or in other parts of the organization that may be dispersed across a country or several countries, as many companies are doing now. So disability and neurodiversity, I mentioned that we do employment on workplace disability inclusion, and I want to just mention I am leveraging off of a lot of those results from our work over many, many years, but I do understand that not everyone thinks of neurodiversity in the disability way. They're not necessarily connected. And many individuals, particularly autistic self-advocates and neurodiverse self-advocates, do not consider themselves as having a disability. But I cross these concepts because we believe that the principles of good workplace practice that we've identified at Cornell can be useful in building more inclusive workplaces for neurodiverse individuals. I also want to acknowledge, and I am sure this has been a part of the conversation in the dialogues across the last 2 days, is that some people use identity first language and other people prefer person first language. So I will probably interchange both of those in this, recognizing that there are certainly preferences among different individuals and different segments of the group that we're talking about, neurodiverse individuals. So the first part of employment is thinking about creating a program. I am thinking about this from the organizational perspective of companies who are exploring these programs. And we teach this to practicing HR professionals We teach it to our undergraduate students who are our aspiring HR professionals. So these are some of the things we tell folks to think about as they're thinking, do I want to build a neurodiversity program? Is first of all, think about where the program should be located within the organizational context. In some companies, it has been driven from the tech sector, from the tech side, where there are open positions, and these programs have been administered and managed from there. In other places, it is becoming embedded in the talent management or human capital side. So it's important to think about where in the organization might you embed this, where are the resources naturally aligned, where will it get the most support as you initiate the program, and where, and this might change over time, where might it move to for the longer term. It's important to think about how you communicate the value of this kind of an initiative. And it's really helpful, it's critical that it be framed as a business imperative and a part of the strategy focus rather than just community service or corporate social responsibility. I think individuals respond better in the applicant pool, but your workforce will respond better if they really understand this as a part of the values of the organization. So it's really important to set that headset in that tone. It's important to set organizational hiring goals, and I will explain why these things are things to think about on the front end of the process. To identify the kinds of jobs that you're going to be recruiting for, and hopefully those are open positions or positions where there's promise for opportunities for expansion and growth in the future. And think about what kind of candidates are you looking for? What are the characteristics, skills, aptitudes that you're going to be recruiting and screening for? And then, and we can leverage off of these wonderful programs that have been in existence now for 5 years, about what are potential concerns so that you can get out in front of those and identify supports that both employees and supervisors might need in the process once you get a program launched. Now, I mentioned that I'm leveraging off of pre-existing research, and indeed, here's an example of that research, and then I'll talk about why it's valuable in this conversation today. As we have on several occasions, we really see human resource professionals as important point people in maximizing the inclusive workplace policies and practices that we're promoting. So we have partnered on numerous occasions with the US Society for Human Resource Management that has over 300,000 members who are in organizations, and find out what they're doing. And then we're able to use that to refine some informational tools for broader audiences. So when we asked about what organizations are doing to implement policies around workplace disability inclusion, we found 3 out of 5 were using the disability term in their D&I language on their website. About half of them had relationships with community organizations that could be pipeline feeders for talent with disabilities. A little less reported actively recruiting, however, and a little more than a third could say that they had strong senior management support for the initiative. About a quarter were using tax incentives, which smaller employers can take advantage of in affirmative hiring. Only about a quarter had explicit goals to hire people with disabilities. Only 1 in 5 had internships for individuals with disabilities, and less than that put up in the performance management of supervisors and executive leaders the affirmative goals around hiring with people with disabilities. So there wasn't that reinforcement. That was one of the areas where there wasn't that reinforcement within the structure to affirm that this is a positive goal that people should be pursuing. So this was important information because we also asked on this survey if companies had successfully hired in the last year. And what we found out is those companies, and there was only a fifth, if you'll remember, that said that they were doing internships, but those companies were far more successful, 6 times more successful in having affirmatively hired successfully individuals with disabilities in the last year. So we know that internships is a very powerful way to identify the talent and to have that talent make their way into the organization. So that's the first thing we usually recommend to companies when they're trying to explore new initiatives that have affirmative hiring goals. Second, and not surprisingly, I'm sure to any of you, is that 5 times more effective if they had strong senior management commitment, 4 times more effective if they had explicit goals for strategically hiring people with disabilities, and 3 times more effective if they said that they were actively recruiting people with disabilities, that they included them in their D&I plans, and if they had relationships with community organizations that could be feeders of talent. So we know these are critical practices. We know that they also can apply to a neurodiverse population, and what we would encourage companies to consider as they think about these initiatives going forward. It's also really important, I said, to anticipate some of the problems that may come up, and set in place goals that will help you to mitigate problems. And so preparing the workplace is a very important part of getting out in front of doing a good job with designing these programs. As I mentioned, top management commitment is important. It's not enough just to have it. However, you need to have the top person talking about it. It should be embedded in the strategic plan for the organization. It should be talked about by top level management, preferably the CEO, but that strategic imperative of affirmative hiring, affirmative inclusion needs to be embedded in the organizational strategy in a very visible way. You must set recruitment, hiring, and retention goals. Again, retention wasn't always what we were thinking about early on in these programs, and now we know it's important to think about that as well as the hiring goals. Important to be training recruiters and supervisors so that they understand when they see neurodiverse candidates how to look for the talent and not just at characteristics that might be a little different behaviorally or socially than what they're used to. Very important to educate them about that and help them to broaden their thinking of how to view talent. Identify internal and external resources to support success for both new employees and supervisors. That might be your employee assistance program. It could be your whole recruiting structure. It might be your orientation program on the front end, but it also is those community organizations that are not only feeders of talent, but can also help with supporting supervisors once that talent is put in place. And include successful outcomes and performance expectations for supervisors. So it's not enough just to put the person in place, but also coach the supervisor and have an understanding that the success of the individual, as well as the team and the unit, is a part of what they will be held accountable for in being an effective manager. So big picture, how to get started. And now we're going to drill down a little bit and think about organizational elements in the front end of the process, and that is recruitment, hiring, and interviewing. We know from some of our research that there are tried and true approaches that maximize your likelihood of success. First is working with higher education institutions that can assist with identifying neurodiverse students who come through service. And we had a great example of this in our prior presentation just before I came on board here today. And working with community organizations, so higher educational institutions and community organizations that serve the target population. There are plenty of community service organizations who are grooming young people who are neurodiverse for the workplace, and tapping into that talent through their supports and having that as a conduit is really helpful. Making proactive hiring initiatives visible in the general recruitment process so that eligible applicants are aware of neurodiversity initiatives. We hear repeatedly from companies that some people will say that they've tried to come in through the regular front door and never made it through the funnel of the screening process and selection processes. But when they come through the special door that is more inclusive for neurodiverse talent, they make it through and they thrive in the organization. So making sure that those special opportunities are visible on your career pages and on your front page, home page, is really important, so the talent finds the right portal, the right place for them to put their application in. Proactively training recruiters and hiring managers about the initiative so they can route eligible applicants to this process if it comes up in the interview process. So it may be that the person comes through the regular door But then if your recruiters and hiring managers are trained, they may know that the person will get supports or specialized training that they might be eligible for, and you can give them that option. It's important also to work with family support organizations who can help to spread the word to family members of autistic persons, and they may assist in their referral. Certainly the companies tell us that sometimes people find themselves on their front door as applicants because family members have become aware of these affirmative hiring programs and encourage their family member to fill out the application and to get in for the interview, which they might not have otherwise done. So making sure that families are a part of your recruitment network is really important. It's also important, besides preparing your workplace and getting those systems in place and getting your conduits in place, to be sure that you work with those community organizations to get the interview supports in place for this candidate. We know from our research that candidates fare better when they have better preparation and they understand what the interview process is going to be about. This assumes that the candidate is qualified for the position, that they're a part of the pool of applicants for interviews, but then they might need supports. So the job search process identifies appropriate candidates. You want a good job match. You can coach, the individuals should be coached about how to do that. It might be resume writing support. Often it's interviewing support, and the coaching that people often benefit from is appropriate dress, hygiene, timeliness in showing up for interviews, preparedness in addressing job requirements and presenting skills, and then following up afterwards. They may need coaching on all or several of those different items. And then it's important to help them, because they might not think to do this, and they would be advantaged in the interview to prepare with knowledge of the company and the position. And also things like social behavioral interaction style, making eye contact, ability to answer questions, talk about other facets about themselves, and handshakes. The way this works best is if the company is actively working, has actively working relationships with community organizations and higher education institutions. That's really what makes this work effectively, because community organizations will only know how to best prepare the candidates when they have that kind of intimate knowledge of the company, the kinds of jobs that they're looking for, and the kinds of questions that they're going to ask in the interview process. So actually, that organization getting familiar with that enables them to be able to be more effective in preparing the candidates to be more successful in that interview process. Next, I want to talk a little bit about also sending the message that your company is neurodiversity inclusive. It needs to be evident. People won't find these programs and won't find this more inclusive conduit into the company unless it's visible on your website and in your recruitment materials. So showing that that's a part of what you're affirmatively recruiting for is really important. It needs to be evident in your marketing materials for the company as a whole, in your recruitment materials, in your D&I statements, and also people respond well to accommodation, making accommodation policies visible. And we know that from just recently doing a review of 40 randomly selected websites of Fortune 500 companies and looking at where they were faring better in a whole host of elements of effective recruiting that we've designed into a recruitment checklist that employers can use. So, and now we're testing that out further with a broader population of companies. So we do know there are certain things companies can do and make evident on their website that will encourage qualified candidates to come in, and you'll find that job match more easily. It's also possible to improve the effectiveness of the interview process and make it more inclusive by training your recruiters about the characteristics of individuals with autism and how they might be disadvantaged in traditional interview approaches, to teach them how to reframe questions in the interview process so that they are not as ambiguous as often we make our interview questions, and focus more on a presentation of skills, afford candidates opportunities to demonstrate their skills rather than talk about them in certain project tasks, rather than having them verbally present information about their related experience and skills. And get the support, as I just mentioned, of local area service providers in preparing that individual for the interview process, which also lessens their anxiety, and perhaps they might even support them in the process by coming to the interview with them if the person needs it and if the company is comfortable with that. So I'm going to say now, this helps people to get in the front door. Once in the front door, it's really important that we begin building those internal supports for the individual by having an effective onboarding process. And here are some of the things that we talk to companies about including and thinking about. They might have a specialized orientation process if they have a large cohort. If you're bringing in a couple dozen candidates at one time, it might be better to have a specialized program. If you're hiring people one or two at a time, it's probably better to have them in an integrated orientation program that you have for all of your candidates, but make sure that in that process that it's clear to everybody that you have accommodations, that you have employee assistance programs, all the kinds of services that you want to be sure all of your employees use, but particularly it might be something that your neurodiverse candidates might be able to take advantage of and need. And you might want to think about, particularly if you are doing a targeted orientation or onboarding approach, who should be included there? Should the supervisors of the individuals, of the units they'll be going to, should the community resource organizations and your internal resource organizations have representation and be able to tell your candidates about that resource for the future? So let's assume your people are in the front door, and then the process really is not too soon to begin immediately thinking about how are you going to retain these individuals? How are you going to keep them interested, nurtured, supported in a way that they feel valued by the organization, but also can maximally be productive for what your business needs are? So I can't say it's how important it is to think about that from right at the front end. It's not enough just to focus on recruitment. It's really important to think about career progression, development, and advancement. One of the benefits we've always heard about this population is that the retention, they are excited about the job and retention is heightened, and that often that they like the position and might want to stay in it. But it's also the case, we're finding, that people like career advancement like everyone else does. And so it's important to not assume that people want to stay in place forever, and to let them know what the opportunities are and how career advancement is made in the organization. So it's important to also talk with them about early on what it takes to advance in the organization, what it takes to stay in the organization, and how performance management is conducted, so that they understand what that process is, what it means to have performance management if this is something that's new to them. And more often than not, it is with these young recruits that we're seeing many companies looking to bring into the organization. Early adopters, as I mentioned, didn't necessarily focus on this part of the employment process, and now they certainly are including it as a part of their overall preparation of their organization. And we do know that proactive policies and practices in this area does mitigate issues significantly. So thinking about this as you design your program is critically important. There are some building blocks of inclusive climate. So you have people in the organization, you're thinking about performance management and retention, and there are some things we know send a message to people that they're wanted and that this is an organization that will do its best to maximize inclusion. We all use our lenses to look for these things in our respective workplaces, and individuals with neurodiverse characteristics are no different. HR practices need to be seen as fairly implemented. Access to opportunities or resources do not depend on the person's demographic background. So this is not only important for the autistic individual to perceive and experience, it's important for their coworkers as well, because we know if coworkers have prior to the initiation of the Neurodiversity-Inclusive hiring program perceive their environment as inclusive, they will not be as likely to see an accommodation as preferential treatment for an individual, feeling confident that accommodations are equitably applied across all employees in the organization. So it's important to look at the importance of building personal relationships between people so that they don't fall back on old stereotypes. As I said about internships, exposure is really important. That's not just important for the individual who gets the opportunity to get some experience on their resume, but it's important because supervisors and coworkers experience the differences in characteristics and how people perform, and it debunks the fact that that these are not capable people when they see them thrive in the work environment and be able to meaningfully contribute. It's important, the implementation of a decision-making process that takes diverse perspectives into account. So by that, I mean that in the organization, all team members are included in conversations and discussions, and there isn't preferential treatment just giving to senior members or to members of a union or to people from particular racial, ethnic backgrounds. That inclusive climate in an organization benefits everybody, including neurodiverse individuals. Now, I've talked several times about supervisors and educating supervisors, and that's really important because we know that, that most people go to their supervisor first when they have a problem, even though we work closely with HR professionals because they govern the workplace policies and practices. We know that an individual is at least 60% more likely to disclose to their supervisor than to the HR office because that's the closest point of contact for them. So it may be asking for an accommodation. It could be that previously they had not disclosed a disability, and once they get into the workplace, they find they need an accommodation and they disclose. So preparing those managers to know how to respond and to know where to go to get the support they need to address an accommodation issue is a really important part of preparation of the workplace, like we talked about previously. When we're talking about career development, there are elements that we can think about. I can't emphasize enough training and supporting supervisors in the performance management process and the career development process so they understand how to navigate that with neurodiverse individuals, which benefits all of us, clear job descriptions and work expectations, encouraging regular dialogues between the supervisor and the individual. Supervisors' regular observations of work performance and feedback on progress. All of us benefit from that, but it's can be particularly true for neurodiverse individuals. And giving them, presuming that they want to stay forever in the same jobs, giving them an opportunity for special projects, stretch assignments, to assess their readiness for next steps and give them an opportunity to consider that. Also offering training opportunities and providing mentorship and sponsorship within the organization to facilitate advancement. And we do see in successful programs that are mature or are 5 years or so old, that a lot of mentoring and sometimes buddy systems, which is more social in nature, are built into these programs. Mentoring benefits all staff, not just those with autism, and it isn't required in our disability rights, employment rights in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's not required for us, but we do know it's in good practice that it can be very valuable support for neurodiverse candidates, but again, for all employees. And I would say, we're talking about mentoring new recruits, but also it's important if you have seasoned individuals in the organization who do identify as autistic or neurodiverse, to use them as proteges, not only for your autistic candidates, but also for other members of your workforce so they get that reverse mentoring opportunity as well. The benefits of mentoring: a broadened perspective on the transferability of skills, so the individual can be made aware of the fact that what they're doing now could be used in other places, so they consider other positions. Maybe discussing career directions that they should consider. Help them to get motivated to take calculated risks. If this is a first full-time job for a person, they may be very nervous about what they perceive to be jeopardizing that by taking calculated risks to go on to something else. Giving them advice on the politics of relationships with within the organization, which they may not be privy to and not naturally sense, like many of the rest of us might do. Giving them honest and constructive feedback about problem areas in a safe relationship environment. Coaching them on technical, interpersonal, and management skills. Giving them more generally encouragement in what they're doing. And also helping them with networking contacts, references, and introductions, both on the professional side, but it also might be on the social side. And with that, I will talk more about what is usually we see now built in as also social supports, as sometimes, not always, but sometimes autistic individuals might be a little socially more introverted or awkward. And so we see that many programs are using buddies, mentors, job coaches, and case managers to support the individual in appropriate interaction in the professional site, but also how they might better socialize both within the workplace and also around the workplace, using external community resources or also social networks that are a natural part of the organization that the person might not themselves be ready to reach out to. Interest groups, special social groups, and that helps them to get more integrated into the workplace as a whole. Here's what this looks like in a schematic, and I attribute this to Jose Velasco, a colleague from SAP, who showed the importance of these internal and external resources that are often used. This is certainly a model used at SAP that we see in some form regularly approximated across autism at work programs and other companies as well. Here's some examples of retention issues and ways to address them. These are not necessarily true of all individuals, and like in the general workplace, each employee is individual in their own unique assets and strengths they bring to the workplace, but it is true for individuals with autism that issues might arise, and here's some of the issues in retention we've heard about and we observe. Difficulties with executive functioning like memory, concentration, organization, time management, social integration, which I just mentioned. It might be within the workplace, difficulty with team organization or supervisor interactions, the way the person interacts, but it also can be, if they're different from their colleagues in how they behave, bullying, harassment that the organization needs to step in and address. It may be sensory sensitivities like to light, sound, smells, noise, and distractions, or it could be stress management and mental health issues like self-esteem, anxiety, depression, and sleep. So if you're dealing with performance management, if some of these things come up, the way they can be mitigated is providing regular feedback. It's no less true for neurodiverse individuals as it is for the rest of us. That really helps. This could be more anxiety producing, so it's really important to prepare the individual in advance before these exchanges occur, and be sure that there's equitable treatment in the performance management process, and that could be disequitable in that there might be higher expectations or less tolerance for deviation in terms of how the person executes the job, or it could be an undue permissiveness. And really what we want is a balance of fair expectations, but also a recognition that the person might need additional supports. So the things that help is preparing supervisors by educating upfront, proactively preparing the individual for performance management, helping managers to navigate the importance of equitable treatment. And some individuals may prefer assurances about being able to continue to function in the same role rather than being pushed into different roles, and talking with them about what's preferable. There are some other things to consider, and this helps with sustainability and scalability, perhaps using job coaches, mental health issues, social networking, transportation, family and housing considerations. This may be a first job for many people. They might have been living at home and want to move out of their housing. Job coaches in the United States, and it's different, it can be different in each country, but these are often governmentally provided supports to assist the individual during supervisor or job changes if behaviors arise once the person's in the workplace. For us in the US, it might be available at no cost. And so having relationships with these governmental organizations in advance of these programs and why you have these programs is really important, but also preparing the supervisor in the workplace that an individual who's supporting the person might be periodically there to support both the supervisor and the individual is an important part of that education process. Now, I mentioned mental health considerations because they can surface for individuals because of anxiety, high anxiety. It can be a comorbid condition. So it's important to proactively make supervisors aware of the signs and also of available resources. Many of them are internal to the organization, like employee assistance program supports, but it could be that you also have supports in the external organizations that you work with as well. Social considerations, as I said, individuals might be awkward and might find social networking more difficult than our general workforce. That might leave them socially isolated. So it's important to think about ways to help them to naturally network both within the work environment and in the broader social community. And that's where these buddies or community company social groups or facilitation of group participation efforts by a buddy or a mentor comes in very handy. I mentioned transportation because we know only about 24% of people with autism drive compared to 90% of the population without autism. And so it may be the case that we need to help the person with public transportation or facilitating carpooling from their respective neighborhoods. But it also might be that driver's education is a part of what you encourage the individual to do. So linking with existing company transportation alternatives or community resources to help with driving can be a very valuable part of their goals, their annual goals. I would like to mention just family considerations because we know that from national US Census data, 1 in 4 American households has a person with a disability in it. That's not necessarily a neurodiverse individual, but if we take all neurodiversity together, it's close to 20% of the US workforce. So that means many people in every workplace are going to have some familiarity and some empathy towards neurodiversity. So working with community family organizations is really important to be able to get individuals who have these interests, your existing workforce, networked to these resources, and showing that will speak volumes to your workforce about being a caring organization. So we also know that it's important when you have candidates in the workplace to balance the degree of involvement with family members because these are autonomous employees with the concerns families might have in terms of how their family member is faring in the workplace. And to involve them in if the individual is articulating an interest in moving from family dependence to more independence and helping them with navigating those community transitions, which is where housing comes in. Many individuals may still be living with their families, but when they actually have a livable wage, they want to live on their own, but they may not be prepared to do that. So it may be helping them identify how to do these housing leases, cooking, nutrition, balancing a checkbook. Here's where it's really important to not only interface with family interests, but also with those community organizations that might be able to help you with providing that kind of support. So in summary, it's important to embed these neurodiversity affirmative hiring initiatives in the business strategy of the organization. It does take some advanced thinking in order to be successful, but you have a pretty good template based on the experiences of all these companies who've been leaders in this area over the last 5 years. And I've shared some of those steps with you. So hopefully that's going to be helpful. Preparing your workplace is imperative. There are, as I just shared, known good practices to heighten success. Preparing recruiters and supervisors is an absolute must. They're critical in this process. Using existing company resources assists in normalizing employment support processes so that people aren't sticking out in that need for support. Using your employee assistance or business resource groups, ergonomics offices, accommodations offices naturally can provide supports. But also it is important to work with community organizations because they may get you more targeted, specialized expertise when you need it, not only the candidates, but supporting the candidates once they're in the work environment. I also want to point out that I do have resources at the end of this deck. I have talked about our research, and here you'll see in the bottom of the slides, there are many of the research manuscripts or the existing publications that have come out of the research have been referenced, and here's a list of those. Many of them are available open source on our website. Also on our Cornell website, we have a partnership with DXC Technology, I'm very proud to say, and DXC has graciously given us all of the materials from its Dandelion program to share open source more broadly with everyone globally. And so all of those materials are available downloadable from this website. I've given you the link. Please take advantage of them. They're extraordinary resources and available to you. And we keep updating them with new materials as they come forward. And I will also mention that we do have online coursework available from eCornell about both our broader workplace disability inclusion policies and practices, as I just mentioned, that we're drawing from in the design of our neurodiversity-inclusive protocols. And we have one just focused on autism at work programs as well. And these are really targeting HR professionals, but we're finding people from all kinds of employment representation, EEO, labor relations, are coming to these programs. So they're pretty broadly, I think, broadly applicable and broadly useful. And with that, I will say thank you very much for your attention and your time, and more specifically for the opportunity to participate in this two-day event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanne. And just I think there was one question, but I think you might have answered it in your last two slides, where someone was looking, is there any special tools or programs to explain to employers the neurodiverse qualities of their employees in terms of, in the case of autism, eye for detail, finding gaps, etc. So I'm guessing in those resources that you named at the end, there might be something there.
There certainly are things there, but I know my colleagues who have been presenting also have many resources. If you go to Nancy Doyle's website, you'll find plenty of resources there. Marcia Shiner has resources on her website. There are certainly ours at Cornell, but there are many people represented in these 2 days where there's a wealth of resources people can draw from. So just reach out to us and let us know, and we'll point you to those.
Thank you so much, Susanne, and thanks for a lovely presentation. It was excellent, so much information. And thank you for the segue into the next speaker.